Do you have a stack of 8x8 paper that you want to use up? Hi, I'm Jess from JessCrafts.com and I'm here to help you make the most of your crafty supplies and time. So let's get making. Today I have a paper busting template that shows you how to use 8x8 paper to make a card with no scraps. In this case, specifically 3 of the same card. So you'll cut the paper according to this template and then you'll assemble it according to this sketch. And this is available for download with a link in the video description. I have the Ocean Bliss collection from the Paper Boutique. It is made in the UK, so hopefully it's a little bit easier to get outside the US. I try to mix it up and use papers from different sources so that no matter where you're watching from, you'll see a paper that either appeals to you, is available to you, etc. So I'm going to start by cutting my 8x8 paper according to the template. I'm going to cut 2 different pieces of 8x8 paper because it is single-sided. If it was double-sided, a lot of times I would just use one piece and use both sides of it. So, according to the template, it says to cut 3 pieces that are 4 by 4. So I'm going to start by cutting it to 4 by 8 and then 4 by 4. As you can see, I'm cutting 2 pieces of paper at one time just to make things a little bit quicker. But if you're worried about your paper slipping or if that feels difficult to you, just cut 1 piece of paper at a time. Then I have this 4 by 4 area that's left and it's going to get cut up into some smaller pieces for the strips at the top and bottom of the card. I designed it such that you could use directional pattern paper. So I intentionally made the strips cut the way they are so that it works with directional pattern paper, and that's why you want to make sure if you do have anything that's directional, which this paper where they're on the diagonal kind of is, you want to make sure that you're cutting with that paper on top or paying attention to the directionality. So we're going to cut it in half to 2 by 4, and then each of these gets cut to 1 and basically 1 1/3 inches. I realize that's kind of a difficult measurement. A bunch of it is going to be tucked under this 4 by 4 square, or enough of it that I don't have to be super accurate. So I can't cut them to 1 1/2, but 1 1/4 is too little. So I'm really just going to take my paper and I'm going to just cut it to kind of between those two, which would technically be 1 3/8, but they won't all measure exactly 1 3/8. Like, that's not possible. Hopefully I didn't just mess that one up. I may have. So 2 of them will be bigger and 1 will be smaller, and that's actually totally fine. You can try to measure out the 1 1/3 inch. I realize it's kind of an odd thing to do, but I wanted to make this template work because there are pattern papers out there that use that 4 by 4 square, and I want to give you an idea for that. So I'm giving you my about there pieces. Next up, I want to cut a piece of coordinating cardstock, and this is going to work out to be pretty efficient on cardstock because I'm going to be able to cut it to 4 1/4 by 8 1/2 with an 8 1/2 by 11 piece of paper, and then cut it again at 4 1/4 and get 2 of the pieces I need with no scraps. And again, be able to do that 4 1/4. Now, if you were only doing 3 cards because you were using the same piece of pattern paper, then this would be what you were left with in terms of scraps, and that's going to help you to get the rest of the things that you need, but I'm going to do a few more because I am making 6 cards and all. I'm using 2 pieces of paper. But this piece that's left is 2 1/2. You are going to want something that is 2 1/4 for those strips along the top. And you might notice that it says you only need a 2 1/4 by 1 inch mat, even though your pieces of pattern paper are bigger than 1 inch. And I did that just to keep things simple because I didn't want you to be wasting a bunch of cardstock when it's going to be tucked underneath. So we'll show a little bit about that as I get further along in the actual making of it, but I'm cutting them to 2 1/4 by 1 inch as prescribed, and it'll look a little bit confusing, but it will make sense in the end. Before you start gluing your 4 by 4 panels onto your 4 1/4 by 4 1/4 mats, I'm gonna stop and I'm gonna cut a banner die out of the center so that it coordinates perfectly and I'm not wasting any additional cardstock. I'm in fact getting something useful out of this. If you have a word die or some other kind of element that you want to cut out, I recommend just kind of taking a beat and seeing if you can get it from your mats before you use more and other cardstock. Another quick tip. So I want to stamp on these banners and I'm gonna make 6 cards. So I'm gonna do this quite a few times. I think that sometimes it's helpful to not have to keep lining it up or to, kind of when you're making a bunch of the same thing, risk it being imperfect. So I'm gonna take my sentiment. I am using a Heffy Doodle stamp set, which they're also a UK-based company, so I thought that kind of paired well with the UK paper. I don't know if this one's is available any longer, but it's called Oceans of Love. Usually they're available for a really long time. They don't retire stamp sets super quickly, but this is an older one. So I have You're Amazing, That's For Sure, and I'm also going to be using the jellyfish later, and I'm going to be stamping this in a navy blue ink to coordinate with the paper that I chose. Deep Sea from Lawn Fawn, and now I've lined it up once in my Misty or other stamp positioning tool, and I can stamp it down and switch it out. So you might be wondering what all this is. I've cut my very favorite banner dies from a thick piece of cardstock, and then I took some low-tack painter's tape, and it's sticky side up. So if you can kind of hear that's the sticky side, so that is what's causing my little cardstock banner here to stick to that, and then I can gently peel it up and put the next one in and stamp it down without having to worry about lining anything up. And if I get an imperfect impression, I can just stamp again. Even if you don't have a stamp positioning tool, I do like using something like this, like a template, because then it holds this little piece of banner in place, whereas if I put it on my desk and I try to stamp down on it, sometimes even just like little motions kind of shift it or it slides around. So I recommend this for inside a stamping tool or not. Take your favorite banner dies, make this template one time and use it for forever basically, or until the stickiness starts to dissolve. So I have my jellyfish paper, and I'm actually going to be using the jellyfish stamp from that Heffy Doodle collection. You may have noticed they actually look pretty similar, so I thought it was a good match there. And I also wanted to show you how I'm going to match up those other papers. Let's also take a look at how this is a mat for this. We are going to just add our adhesive behind our pattern paper pieces and line them up with the very edge here. One of the reasons that I chose to say only do this 1-inch piece, besides the fact that, it would be wasteful otherwise, is that for whatever reason, I tend to have a lot of like 1-inch strip scraps in my colored cardstock, and I don't often have such a slim piece of paper that it needs that mat perfectly, but this is a perfect excuse. So of course I could cut the pattern paper to just 1 inch instead of 1 1/3 inch, but then I would have all those little bits of pattern paper left and nothing to do with them. Whereas if I just tuck them in there, hide them behind there, I'm gonna be happy with my use of the pattern paper, even though it maybe wasn't 100% efficient. And I love this grid mat from Altenew because it's going to make it really, really easy to line up the elements on my A2 size card here. There's an A2 size outline and it's centered so that I'm just taking this like 2-inch strip and just lining it up here, and I'm gonna know it's perfect on the top and the bottom. And then I'll add this, and as you can see, this spans the entire width of the card because it's 4 1/4. If you don't like that, you could leave the card mat off, or you could make your card mats a little smaller, but I like how that turned out. And like I said, this was kind of inspired by those pattern papers that have 4-inch elements. So I'm gonna show another video in the future where I show you how to really make some fast cards with those. I wanna stamp some of the jellyfish from the Heffy Doodle set, and I just wanted to share with you what I do sometimes when I wanna stamp a bunch of the same image. So I take my larger Misty, and this works better with any larger stamping tool, and I stamp one at the very edge of my paper and then have a lot of room to move the paper down. And if I like the image, then I will scooch the paper down just a little bit, depends on how I wouldn't be able to tell you how far because it depends on the size of your image. But this is gonna let me, without having to move the stamp, get several images across. And then I can even, and I'll show you this in just a second, I can turn the paper over and stamp a few more without ever having to move the stamp. I don't like to have to keep trying to pull the stamp up off the MISTI. Part of the point is kind of be able to do those multiple stamping. So now I've put it at the edge of the paper and I'm getting a whole bunch of stamping of this one image rather quickly, but also super precise. In terms of coloring this image, I have chosen a set of colors that worked well with the background cardstock that I chose. And the logic there being that I can pull in that color, bring some brightness, because I did choose a brighter cardstock for my background. I'm going to color with Copic markers. You should be able to follow similar steps for whatever alcohol-based markers you have. You could also definitely do this in watercolor. If you are not the kind of person who likes to stamp and color images, this collection does have some, like you can get paper pads in this collection that have images and sentiments and stuff to use, or you can just try to go on something like Creative Fabrica and buy clip art that coordinates with whatever paper pad you're working with. Sometimes also certain paper lines will have coordinating die cuts and that kind of thing, which can be a good strategy or a good, alternative. So I'm taking my very lightest color and I just kind of did an all over coat. And then I started with my darkest color on the edges and I'm going to move back to my lightest color. Not always how I do this, but a lot of times I'll actually start at my dark and go out to my light. But when I tried doing that with this image, I got a lot of bleeding. I don't know if it has something to do with these particular blues. I'm using Neenah Solar White 80-pound cardstock, and that didn't change, so I know it's not just my cardstock. It may just be that I'm a little out of practice, honestly. I just have not been doing as much Copic coloring lately as I would like to have time to do. But I like to keep it simple when I am coloring a bunch of images for the same set of cards. So that way I make all the color decisions one time. I kind of come up with a method for how I'm going to color, and that allows me to kind of just relax and color a few images. And that can be kind of a nice way to change it up and a little bit of a less stressful way to use markers, because I'm not every single time trying to decide, okay, when you color like 5 or 6 things for the same card, you have to keep making decisions about, colors that go well and that kind of thing. And I did 2 coats because I found that worked best for this particular card, and I'm doing just a very small amount of shading there. Then I would take my Sizzix or EK Tools scissors and cut them out. They're cutter bee scissors. So I had that sentiment. I've already stamped out a whole bunch of them, and my jellyfish that I have stamped and colored, and I'm just taking some scrap cardstock and using that to build up a little layer, kind of like foam tape, behind my critter. And I personally really like when the critter kind of interacts with the sentiment, because I think it draws some more attention to the sentiment. You could put it wherever it kind of looks good to you. Sometimes it looks good if the animal looks like they're kind of looking down at the sentiment. This one he's kind of looking directly at you, so it's also a thing. But if you kind of just draw their eye across the card, that can be helpful in terms of just being a pleasing design. If you found this video helpful, here's another video with more ideas for enjoying your crafty time and supplies. Let me know you like this video with a share to your crafty community. Subscribe and click the bell so you don't miss the next template or tutorial, and check the video description for product links. See you in the next video!